The city lay silent under a grey March sky. Cologne's streets were broken into scars of stone and glass. Smoke drifted from cellars that no longer held families. Only the cathedral stood whole, its towers wounded yet upright, a witness to everything that had been lost. Inside a Panther tank, 4 men sat pressed together. The smell of oil and cordite clung to every surface. They repeated the same short words: range, traverse, ready. The rhythm of training was meant to hide the rhythm of fear. For years they had believed the same truths. A Tiger's 88mm could destroy anything at 2,000 meters. A Panther's gun and sloped armor made it king in open ground. Sherman tanks were only numbers, weak at the front, dangerous only in swarms. They had been told this in films, in manuals, in stories from veterans. The belief had hardened into certainty. Feldwebel Heinrich Krauss pressed a hand against his tunic. Beneath the cloth, a folded letter rested close to his chest. His wife's handwriting was gentle and round. "We keep a place for you at the table." The words traveled with him from field to field. They carried more weight than numbers or charts. The gunner leaned into a cracked periscope. He scanned the square. Rubble lay like bones. A tramcar rested on its side. He knew every shape by heart. A Sherman stood tall, its barrel short. A jumbo wore extra plates. A Stuart was small and quick. These were letters of a language he had learned since training. Then something else appeared, lower to the ground, sharper, with a gun barrel that seemed too long, too heavy, almost like an anti-aircraft piece mounted on tracks. "Das ist kein Sherman," he whispered. "That is no Sherman." His voice cracked in a way the others had never heard. They stared through fractured glass. No briefing had shown this silhouette. No recognition chart had prepared them. The unknown sat still at the edge of the square, watching. For 17 seconds time itself slowed. Inside the tank, the loader tightened his grip on a shell. The radio operator tapped his dial, though only static replied. The commander pressed the letter flat against his chest. Outside, the fog thickened, holding breath with them. The Panther fired first. The shell sparked off the new tank's armor and screamed into the sky. Doctrine said this was impossible. Doctrine said the enemy should already be burning. Then the reply came. The 90mm gun of the Pershing spoke with a sound deeper than thunder. The round slammed into the Panther's front plate. Steel screamed but held. The crew rocked against iron walls. Bolts shook loose. A wrench clattered to the floor. Propaganda had promised invulnerability. The truth pressed against them like the weight of stone. In that moment the letter in a pocket felt more real than the steel that surrounded them. The hunter had become the hunted. The square of Cologne Cathedral was filled with stillness, broken only by the crackle of small fires. The Gothic towers rose like wounded guardians, their stone faces scarred but the fog of smoke made even daylight seem grey. For the German crew inside the Panther, this place was no longer a city. It was a stage where something unknown had entered. Through the periscope the gunner stared at the silhouette. It did not move quickly. It did not hide. The American tank stood calm as if certain of itself. The long gun rested like an outstretched finger pointing judgment. The crew felt that confidence more than the steel. Krauss gave orders with a voice, steady but heavy. "Fire again." The loader slammed another shell into the breech. The gun recoiled with a violent shake. The round struck sparks but bounced away. It was as if they were throwing stones at a wall. The myth of superiority cracked with each ricochet. Inside the Pershing, another crew worked in silence. Staff Sergeant Robert Early scanned the square through his cupola. His gunner, Clarence Smowier, adjusted the sight. Crosshairs steady. They had been briefed in secret. They had trained to wait for this exact duel. The moment had now arrived under the towers of Cologne. The first reply from their 90mm gun thundered across the square. It did not yet kill, but it shook. Inside the Panther, the radio operator felt the impact vibrate his teeth. He whispered a prayer, though no one answered. The loader's hands trembled as he touched the next round. Training could not erase the knowledge that they were facing something built to kill them. Krauss pressed his chest again. The letter lay there, soft paper against hard cloth. The words from home spoke of bread, of a table waiting, of children drawing houses with smoke rising from chimneys. The memory of normal life felt farther away than Moscow, farther even than the Rhine, yet in that pocket it was still close. The gunner asked the question none wanted to hear. "Can it kill us front on?" Krauss did not answer. He looked once more through the broken periscope. The new tank still waited, patient, unhurried. The cathedral bells were silent, but the square felt full of sound. Engines idled, flames hissed from shattered beams, boots of scattered soldiers crunched in debris as they fled. Another shell from the Pershing struck the Panther. The armor held, but the message was clear. The Americans had changed the rules. The crew who had once felt like hunters now tasted fear. The periscope lens fogged with the gunner's breath. The loader pressed a hand to the steel wall as if feeling the heartbeat of the tank itself. Kraus spoke at last. "It is not just a tank. It is proof." He did not explain proof of what. Perhaps proof that the war was lost. Perhaps proof that faith in steel was faith in smoke. In the square of Cologne, first impressions became final truths. The long gun of the Pershing had arrived, and the illusion of invincibility had already begun to die. The hours inside a tank were always the same. Long stretches of waiting, short bursts of fear. The men lived in a rhythm of engines, commands, and silence. The Panther in Cologne was no different. Between the echoes of shells, the crew slipped into habits that had carried them through winters in Russia and hedgerows in France. The loader checked the ammunition racks again. His fingers traced the brass casings as if counting could change their fate. The gunner adjusted the cracked periscope, even though the lens would never clear. The radio operator tapped the dial and muttered at the static. Routine gave them the illusion of control. Routine was the only thing left when certainty was gone. Yet every routine was haunted by memory. The letter in Kraus's pocket had lines that spoke of bread fresh from the oven and a table where a place was kept for him. He remembered evenings when his son sat across from him drawing tanks on scraps of paper. The boy always drew them larger than houses, with guns that stretched across the page. Kraus had smiled then. Now the memory weighed heavy. The gunner carried his own memory. He had kept spectacles from his father, though the glass was cracked and the frame bent. He never wore them, but he touched them before battles. A small habit, a small anchor. The spectacles stayed in a pouch by his seat even now. Outside the tank, the routine of war also played on. American infantry moved between ruins, rifles at the ready. Engineers checked rubble for mines. A cameraman lifted his lens toward the square, unaware that his film would one day be played in classrooms and museums. For them too, war was repetition. March, halt, scan, breathe. For the Pershing crew, the waiting felt similar. Staff Sergeant Early leaned on his cupola, watching. His gunner Clarence moved his sight only a fraction at a time. They had drilled for months in Kentucky fields before crossing the ocean. They had repeated the same gunnery exercises until the commands were muscle and not thought. Now that muscle memory carried them even as the sight of a panther made their hands sweat. Routine hid fear, but it could not erase it. In Cologne, the square was filled with ghosts of civilian routines. Shop signs broken but still visible. Tram rails bent but still leading somewhere. A bakery's doorframe stood without walls, as if bread might still be waiting inside. The men inside both tanks saw these fragments and felt the weight of what once was ordinary. The Panther's engine growled low. The crew breathed in rhythm with the machine. They told themselves that steel and skill would carry them again. But the letter, the spectacles, the small private anchors reminded them that war was never only about machines. It was about what they had left behind. In the stillness between shells, daily life returned only as memory. A table, a chair, a loaf of bread, a child's drawing. These quiet details were more powerful than the roar of engines. They reminded each man of what he truly fought for, and of what he feared he would never see again. Inside the cramped hull of the Panther, the air was heavy with oil and smoke. The loader sat with one hand on the shell, the other brushing against the fold of his tunic. He felt the edges of paper hidden close to his chest. A letter, creased, worn, smudged with oil from weeks of handling. It was the only thing that smelled of home in a world of steel. The letter had traveled from a small village near Leipzig. His wife had written of spring buds breaking through frozen soil. She described their child chasing a wooden hoop down the lane. She had written of bread baked with rye, borrowed from neighbors. Words simple and fragile, yet stronger than armor. He had read those lines by candlelight during quiet nights, tracing each curve as if touching her hand. Now, as he pressed against the cold steel of the turret, the letter burned in his thoughts. The crew could not see it, but they knew it was there. They had their own symbols tucked into boots and pouches. Spectacles, a prayer book, a ribbon. Each was a bridge between the square of Cologne and a world that still had laughter. The Pershing crew had their own anchors. Early had a letter too, folded in the lining of his jacket. His was from his mother in Ohio. She had written about apple pie cooling on the sill, about neighbors gathering for church even as the town rationed sugar and coffee. The words felt ordinary, but in war ordinary was treasure. He had read them again before dawn, knowing he might never read them again. Between the two tanks, across the square, lay the silence of waiting. Engines hummed low, guns pointed through smoke, but beneath the weight of steel, it was the letters that mattered most. Words written by trembling hands far from the front now shared space with shells and fuel. The cameraman, crouched near a broken wall, captured only the movement of turrets and the flash of barrels. He could not see the folded pages pressed close to hearts. History would later speak of armor thickness and muzzle velocity, but in this moment, war was carried in ink. The loader thought of reading his letter again. He imagined his wife's handwriting. He heard his child's laughter. He asked himself if he would ever return to answer those lines. He knew the gun beside him could end in silence before he could fold the page again. For Early, the American commander, the letter from home was also a compass. It reminded him why he had crossed the ocean. It told him there was something waiting after the smoke cleared. He carried those words into battle as surely as his crew carried shells. 2 tanks, 2 crews, 2 letters, each page fragile as dust, yet heavy enough to shape courage and fear. The battle was seconds away. Engines roared, turrets locked, the steel would speak. But in the final stillness, it was the letters that held the greatest weight. Words of home standing against the illusion of invincibility. The first shot rang out across Cologne Square. The Panther's shell struck the Pershing's front armor and sparked off into the air. For 3 years, German crews had trusted that their guns would always speak last. Now the impossible had happened. The round had bounced. Inside the Panther, silence followed the recoil. The gunner blinked. The loader froze with a shell in his hands. The commander felt the crack in his faith deeper than the crack in his optics. For years, training manuals and propaganda leaflets had promised them superiority. Tigers could not be killed from the front. Panthers could break any Allied armor. But here, in the shadow of the cathedral, the truth cracked open like steel. Then the Pershing's 90mm gun fired. The sound was not just thunder, it was judgment. The shell tore into the Panther's mantlet, flames bursting through the turret. In that instant, the crew's belief collapsed. The loader's letter burned at the edges as fire reached the fabric of his tunic. His final anchor to home curled in smoke. Survivors scrambled from hatches. Some crawled, some stumbled. The commander looked back at the machine that had been his shield and saw only a coffin. He felt shame not just at defeat, but at the lie he had carried. They had been told they were untouchable. Now he saw himself as just another soldier in a war already lost. Across the square, Early and his Pershing crew sat in silence after the shot. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They looked at the wreck and saw men, not machines. Clarence lowered his hands from the gun controls and muttered a prayer. Early pulled his letter from his jacket and pressed it once before tucking it back. Victory carried no joy, only relief. For the Germans, disbelief turned into doubt. If one shot could shatter them here, what other truths were lies? Had the High Command been wrong about everything? Was the Reich's promise of destiny already ashes? Some whispered these questions aloud in the confusion. Others swallowed them, choking on fear. The letter, half-burned, lay among the wreckage. Words of bread and laughter lost under smoke. It was not the machine that broke their faith. It was the realization that illusions had cost them everything. They had fought for superiority that did not exist. They had carried hope in steel that could now be pierced like paper. The cameraman's film caught fire blooming from the turret. The world would remember the duel as proof of American firepower. But for the men who lived it, the greater wound was invisible. Belief had been pierced. Propaganda had failed. And without faith in superiority, there was only the raw truth of mortality. In that moment, the war changed. Not on maps or in speeches, but in the hearts of tankers who knew the story of invincibility had ended. What replaced it was fear, guilt, and shame. Not just for themselves, but for every man who had trusted the same lie. The square was silent again, broken only by the crackle of fire from the ruined Panther. The cathedral's shadow stretched long over the rubble. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The surviving Germans crawled out, hands raised, faces smeared with smoke and ash. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. They no longer looked like soldiers of a mighty they looked like men who had seen the death of belief. American infantry closed in with rifles ready, but they did not fire. They gestured for the tankers to drop their pistols. to move toward the line of prisoners already forming at the edge of the square. The Pershing crew watched from inside their tank, the gun still smoking. No one cheered, no one gloated. The battle had lasted minutes, but it had rewritten years of certainty. Early climbed out of his Pershing, his boots sinking into ash. He watched the captured Germans shuffle past. One man still clutched a scrap of paper, half burned, the edges black. Early recognized it for what it was, letter, a fragment of a world far from Cologne. He thought of the letter in his own pocket. In that moment, enemy and ally seemed less like opposites, and more like mirrors. For the German commander, surrender was heavier than chains. He had once sworn to fight to the last shell. Now he walked with empty hands, haunted by the faces of his crew, who would never walk again. He thought of his son's drawings of invincible tanks, and he knew he could never write the truth back home. He felt shame, but also a strange relief. The illusion was over. The burden of false superiority had burned away in the square. As prisoners were marched away, the Pershing crew sat on their hull and breathed in the cold air. Clarence muttered that it smelled like Ohio in November. Another crewman lit a cigarette but let it die between his fingers. Each man was thinking of home, of streets without rubble, of tables without rations, of mornings without the fear of fire. The cameraman lowered his lens. He had captured the duel that would echo across history. But even he knew the greater story was not the flash of the gun. It was the quiet steps of men walking into captivity, their illusions left behind in smoke. That night, in the ruins of Cologne, both sides found silence. American crews cleaned their barrels and checked their engines. German prisoners huddled in a courtyard, clutching whatever scraps of memory they still carried. One wrote in the margin of his half-burned letter by the light of a broken lamp. He did not know if it would ever be delivered. War had turned soldiers into ghosts of themselves. Yet in the aftermath, small acts of memory endured. A folded page, a glance at the cathedral, a thought of bread baking far away. These quiet fragments were the only victories left. The duel at Cologne Cathedral became more than a clash of steel. It became a story that traveled across borders, into films, books, and memories. The Pershing's long gun had ended a single battle, but its real shot had struck deeper, piercing illusions that had carried German crews through years of war. For veterans, the legacy lingered in silence. German tankers who survived captivity spoke years later of that day as the moment their faith in superiority collapsed. They admitted that many had never faced a Pershing again, but the fear of it lived in every encounter afterward. They called it the shadow tank, a machine that haunted their decisions long after the smoke cleared. American crews remembered it differently. For them, the Pershing was not invincible. It broke down, it struggled with mud, its shells missed as often as they struck. But in Cologne, it had stood equal to the Panther, and that equality mattered more than perfection. To them, the duel was proof that American engineering and sacrifice had caught up, that they were no longer sending boys into hopeless fights against myths of German armor. The letters carried their own legacy. In museums today, visitors sometimes see the half-burned page recovered from the Panther wreck. The handwriting speaks of bread and spring fields, of a child's laughter. It rests behind glass near the photographs of the duel. Across from it lies a letter written by Sergeant Early's mother, sent from Ohio and kept in his jacket through the final weeks of war. 2 letters, 2 sides, 2 proofs that war was carried home in ink as much as in steel. Historians studied the film of the duel frame by frame. They calculated angles, shell velocities, armor thickness. They debated tactics, yet beyond the mathematics, the footage captured something harder to measure. The moment men realized that illusions could die faster than machines. The legacy of Cologne was not just technological parity. It was the human truth that no army, no nation, no belief could remain invincible forever. Decades later, veterans stood together at reunions. Some German tankers shook hands with former American crewmen. They spoke not of hatred, but of survival. They shared stories of letters, of children, of the silence that followed battles. In those meetings, the illusion of enemy dissolved into recognition of shared humanity. The cathedral still stands in Cologne. Tourists walk across the square without knowing how many illusions died there. Few notice the scars on the stones. Fewer still remember the names of the men inside those tanks. But the story lives on in film, in museums, in whispered memories passed down through families. The Pershing did not end the war alone. It did not crush armies by itself, but it carried a truth across decades. Superiority is never permanent. Propaganda cannot shield men from reality, and sometimes the smallest objects, a folded letter, a page of handwriting, speak louder than any gun. The legacy of that March day was not only the end of German tank illusions, it was the reminder that behind every machine were men, and behind every man was a home waiting, hoping, writing. The long gun fired once, but the letter endured across time. Together, they told the story of illusions broken and humanity remembered.